The boy's voice cracked like dry timber when he said it, and Della Sullivan felt her heart splinter into 100 pieces right there in the middle of Grant Hunter's barn. "You are not my father," 8-year-old Caleb said, his chin quivering but his dark eyes blazing with a fury that was entirely his father's, entirely Thomas Sullivan's, and the sight of it nearly brought Della to her knees. "You cannot tell me what to do. You cannot tell me anything. My father is dead and you are nothing." The word landed like a rifle shot in the hay-sweet air. Nothing. Grant Hunter did not flinch. That was the remarkable thing, the thing that Della would remember for the rest of her life, long after the dust settled and the seasons turned and everything became clear. He did not step back, did not raise his voice, did not reach for the easy anger that most men would have grabbed like a weapon. He simply lowered himself onto one knee in the straw, so that his eyes were level with Caleb's red-rimmed, furious, heartbroken ones, and he said something in a voice so quiet and so steady that it cut straight through all of Della's carefully built defenses like a knife through warm butter. "You are right," Grant said. "I cannot replace your father. I would never insult you or his memory by trying, but I can show you what loyalty looks like, Caleb, if you will let me." The boy stared at him. Della pressed her fingers to her mouth. Caleb turned and ran out of the barn into the burning Kansas afternoon, his boots kicking up red dust behind him, and Grant Hunter slowly rose to his full height, 6 feet 2 inches of broad-shouldered, sun-weathered rancher, and he looked at Della with eyes the color of a winter sky, and all the secrets and sorrows between them hung in the air like smoke. This was not where their story began. To understand how they arrived at this moment, this terrible, beautiful, pivotal moment, you have to go back to the autumn before, when Della Sullivan arrived in Caldwell, Kansas, with 2 suitcases, a grief that had no bottom, and a son who had stopped speaking to almost everyone. The year was 1882, and the Kansas frontier was no place for a woman alone. Della had known that when she boarded the train in St. Louis. She had known it when she pressed her forehead against the rattling window glass and watched the cities thin out into prairies that went on forever, golden and terrifying and vast. She had known it when the conductor took her ticket and looked at her with something between pity and warning in his weathered face. She was 28 years old, a widow of 14 months, possessed of $63, a small plot of land she had inherited from her brother along the Kaskaskia River, and a son who had witnessed his father's death and not been the same since. Thomas Sullivan had been killed by a spooked horse in February of 1881. It had been senseless and sudden and final in the way that only accidents can be, no build-up, no warning, no chance to say the things that needed saying. One moment Thomas was leading the mare across the icy street in front of their St. Louis home, and the next moment something had startled the animal, a crack of ice, a shout from somewhere, and she had reared and come down, and Thomas had been underneath her, and that had been the end of everything Della had known. Caleb had been 7. He had been standing on the front steps watching his father. He had seen all of it. In the 14 months that followed, Della had tried everything she knew to bring her son back from the distant, locked place he had retreated to. She had hired a tutor who specialized in grieving children. She had taken Caleb to church and to the park and to the river on Sundays. She had held him through nightmares that left them both shaking. She had read to him until her voice gave out. None of it was enough. The boy who had once filled a room with noise and laughter had become a quiet, watchful stranger who sometimes looked at her with Thomas's eyes and broke her heart all over again. And then her brother's letter had arrived. James had died the previous spring, not long after Thomas, and the letter was from his lawyer, a tract of land along the Kaskaskia, deeded to Della as the last surviving member of her family. It was not much. 60 acres of mixed grass and scrubland with a small 2-room house that had been unoccupied for 2 seasons. But it was something. It was a direction to move in when she desperately needed one. Her friends in St. Louis thought she had lost her mind. Perhaps she had. But something deep in her bones told her that staying in that city, in that house where every corner held the shape of Thomas, was slowly killing both her and Caleb by degrees. They needed open air. They needed space. They needed something new to look at. What she had not anticipated was Grant Hunter. She first saw him at the general store in Caldwell 3 days after she arrived, on a morning in October that smelled of cold earth and coming rain. He was arguing politely, but firmly with the store owner over the price of fencing wire, and even from across the crowded room, there was something about him that made Della notice him without meaning to. He was perhaps 33 or 34, with dark hair that was starting to silver at the temples, and a face that had been shaped by years of sun and wind into something honest and angular and severe. He wore a plain brown coat and boots that were clean but clearly well used, and he spoke in that particular quiet way of men who rarely needed to raise their voices because people generally listened the first time. She had not come to Kansas looking for anything of the kind. She was emphatic about that, at least in her own mind. She had come to work the land and raise her son and rebuild something from the rubble of her previous life. The last thing she needed was complication in the shape of a man. But then he had turned some instinct, perhaps, the way people sometimes turn when they are being studied, and found her eyes across the store, and Della had looked away quickly, feeling heat rise in her face in a way she had not felt in a very long time, and had hated herself a little for it. She bought her flour and salt pork and left without speaking to him. She did not think she would see him again. Caldwell was not a small town by frontier standards. It was a cattle town, loud and busy during the drives and quieter in the off months, but still populated enough that 2 people could reasonably avoid each other without much effort. She thought wrong. He appeared at her fence line 4 days later. She was outside in the thin morning light trying to determine whether the fence posts her brother had put in were still sound, with Caleb sitting on the top rail watching her with the hollow expression that had become his default, when a horse and rider came along the track that ran north of her property. The rider stopped when he reached her fence line and tipped his hat, a gesture so reflexively courteous that it seemed to come from deep in his marrow. "Morning," he said. "You are the Sullivan woman who took over James's place." It was not a question, exactly. Della straightened and looked up at him. Up close, his eyes were a striking pale gray-blue, the kind of color she associated with winter skies or river ice, and they held a directness that was not unkind but brooked no pretense. "I am," she said. "Della Sullivan, and you are Grant Hunter. I run the Hunter Ranch, the property north and east of yours." He glanced at Caleb, still perched on the fence rail. "Your son." "Caleb," she said, because Caleb would not say it himself, had barely said anything to strangers since Thomas died. Grant looked at the boy for a moment with those steady gray eyes, and then he said, in a completely matter-of-fact tone, "The fence on your south corner is leaning. Freeze-thaw cycles all last winter. I can send one of my men to help you shore it up if you like, before the real cold comes." Della blinked. She had expected something more, she was not sure what, some version of the paternalistic concern she had gotten from every man in St. Louis who'd learned she was heading west alone. Some version of "you should not be out here. Some version of this is no place for a woman." What she had not expected was practical, neighborly advice delivered without drama or condescension. "I would appreciate that," she said after a moment. He nodded. "I will send Ray Cobb over Thursday. He is good with posts." He moved to ride on, then paused. "James was a decent man. I am sorry for your loss." He said it the way a person says something they genuinely mean but have no desire to perform, simply, cleanly, without requiring anything from her in return. And then he rode on, and Della watched him go, and felt something she had not felt in a very long time, the faint, unsettling flutter of being seen. Ray Cobb came Thursday and fixed the fence posts. He was a young man of about 22, friendly and gap-toothed, who talked to Caleb about horses with cheerful persistence until Caleb actually asked, in a voice rusty with disuse, what kind of horse Mr. Hunter kept. Ray Cobb beamed as if he had won a prize and launched into a lengthy description of Grant Hunter's Appaloosa stallion, a horse named Ridgeback. And by the time they were done for the day, something in Caleb's face had shifted almost imperceptibly, like a door opened just a crack. It was small, but Della noticed. She noticed everything where Caleb was concerned. The following week, Grant Hunter came himself. He arrived in the early afternoon with a bundle of dried goods from the store in town, things she had not asked for but clearly needed, given that her larder was still thin from the move, and set them on her porch without ceremony. "Town had a surplus delivery," he said, when she looked at him with surprise and some suspicion. "I pass right by your road on the way back." She had not thanked him effusively. She had too much pride for that, and she sensed correctly that he would find it embarrassing. She simply said, "That is kind of you," and offered him coffee, which he accepted, and they had sat at her small kitchen table for 40 minutes in a conversation that moved from practical matters, the state of her land, the best places to sow seed corn in spring, the quirks of the local weather, to something less definable, something that had the texture of two people genuinely discovering each other. He told her he had come to Kansas from Tennessee at the age of 22, with $100 and a belief in his own ability that had been tested repeatedly and sometimes severely. He had been ranching here for 11 years. He had never married. He said this last thing as a plain fact with no particular weight attached to it, but Della filed it away nonetheless. She told him about St. Louis, about Thomas, about the accident, keeping her voice steady in the way she had trained herself to speak about it. She told him that Caleb had been different since, that she worried about the boy with the particular unrelenting worry of a mother watching her child struggle and being unable to fix it. Grant had listened without interrupting, which was its own kind of gift. Most people interrupted, offering solutions or comfort before she had finished, needing to close the discomfort of the conversation. He simply listened, and when she was done, he said only, "He needs time and ground under his feet. Both of those things this land can give him if you let it." She had looked at him across the rim of her coffee cup and thought, "This man is either very wise or very practiced at seeming so, and I am not yet certain which." As the weeks turned, she began to suspect the former. November settled over the Kansas plains with a gray, cold persistence, and the two properties found natural reasons to interact. Grant's cattle sometimes drifted toward her fence line and needed gentling back. Her well pump developed a fault that Ray Cobb came to assess and Grant came to actually fix, arriving with tools and a particular focused silence that she was beginning to recognize as his working mode, a state of complete present-tense attention that she found oddly comforting. Caleb watched him fix the pump from a distance of about 10 feet, saying nothing, watching everything. When Grant finished, he sat back on his heels and said to the boy, without preamble, "You want to hand me that wrench?" He gestured to the tool on the ground near Caleb's feet. Caleb looked at the wrench, looked at Grant, picked it up and handed it over. "Thank you," Grant said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, and went back to work. It was, Della reflected later, exactly the right move. Not too much attention, not too little, not making Caleb a project or a problem, just including him quietly in the normal business of the day. By December, Caleb had started asking, occasionally, whether Mr. Hunter was coming by. Della was careful about what she felt about this. She told herself it was good for the boy, and it was. She told herself her own warming feelings toward Grant Hunter were incidental and manageable, and told herself this with decreasing conviction as the weeks went on. The dark past Grant carried became apparent slowly, not because he was secretive exactly, but because he was a man who did not volunteer pain without reason. It came out in pieces over the course of the winter months, on the evenings when Della's kitchen became a warm gathering place against the bitter Kansas cold. He had a brother, he told her one evening in January, while the wind drove ice crystals against her window glass. The brother's name was Preston, and he had died 8 years ago, in circumstances that Grant described with a careful neutrality that told her more than the words did. Preston had borrowed money from a man named Carver Doyle, a cattle broker in Wichita who was known on the frontier for his willingness to lend at rates that were designed to trap rather than help. Preston had not been able to repay the debt, and the situation had escalated in the way such situations did in that time and place, when law was thin and men like Carver Doyle were thick with bought friends. "He died," Grant said simply, "because I was not there when I should have been. I was in Abilene chasing a contract that did not come through, and by the time I came back it was too late." Della had said, "It was not your fault." Grant had looked at her with those winter sky eyes and said, "Maybe not entirely, but loyalty means being where you are needed, not where you want to be. I have tried to remember that since." That word loyalty settled into her like a root. The hidden threat that complicated everything emerged in February, 8 months after Della arrived in Kansas. Carver Doyle. She had not known who he was when he appeared at her door on a Tuesday afternoon with 2 men behind him, and a smile that did not reach his eyes. He was perhaps 50, florid and well-fed in the manner of men who took more than their share, dressed better than the average Caldwell businessman in a black wool coat and polished boots. He introduced himself with an elaborate courtesy that made her skin prickle. He wanted to buy her land, not ask want. There was a difference in his manner between want and offer that he did not bother to conceal entirely. He told her that her property sat on a stretch of ground that would be valuable for the cattle routes being planned through the region, that the railroad expansion would drive up prices, that it would be in her best interest to sell now before the market shifted against her. He named a figure that sounded reasonable on its surface, but that something in her gut told her was wrong. She told him she would think about it. After he left, she thought about it for approximately 3 minutes and then drove over to Grant Hunter's ranch to tell him what had happened. She had not realized, until she saw his face go very still and very cold at the name Carver Doyle, how deeply the shadow of that man had already fallen across her land and her life. "He killed my brother," Grant said quietly after a moment. He was standing in his barn, a harness half-mended in his hands, and he set the harness down with the careful deliberateness of a man controlling a response that wanted to be far less controlled. Not with his own hands, but he sent men, and they made it look like an accident, and there was never enough proof for the law to do anything about it. He has been working this region for 20 years. He uses debt and threats and sometimes violence. He acquires land from people who do not know how to resist him. "He is trying to trap me," Della said. It was not a question. The word had come to her clearly with the certainty of instinct. "Yes," Grant said. "If you sign anything he puts in front of you, he will find ways to claim more than you signed away. That is his method." "Then I will not sign." Grant looked at her. Something shifted in his expression, a kind of respect that sat beside something warmer, something more complicated. "He will not take no easily. He never does. His men will find ways to make your life difficult." "So will this winter," Della said, and there was something in her voice that made Grant Hunter almost smile. The first real approximation of one she had seen from him, a brief and genuine flash of something that softened the severity of his face into something that made her chest ache. "I did not come this far to be frightened off my land by a man in a good coat." "No," Grant said, "I do not imagine you did." He paused, and then he said, "I want to help you, if you will allow it. Not because you are a woman alone who needs help, you are clearly capable of handling a great deal, but because that man already cost me someone I loved, and I will be damned before I let him take anything else." The word damned, spoken so quietly in the lamplight of the barn, landed between them with the weight of something deeply personal, something that lived in him the way old grief lives, constant and bone-deep. "Then we will deal with it together," Della said. And something between them shifted permanently in the way that a stone shifts in a riverbed and redirects the current. The trouble with Carver Doyle was not long in coming. Through March, small things began to go wrong on Della's property. A section of fence she was certain had been sound was found cut. One of her chickens disappeared, then 2 more, which could have been a fox but felt like something else. A notice appeared, nailed to her gate post one morning, written in a legal-looking hand that claimed a prior lien on her property from a debt her brother allegedly owed. A document that Grant's contact in Caldwell, a lawyer named Elliot Marsh, identified immediately as fraudulent. "He is trying to manufacture a legal basis to seize the property," Marsh said, spreading the document on his desk, "so that even if you resist, he can tie it up in territorial court long enough to make you give up and leave." "I will not give up and leave," Della said. "No," Grant said from the chair beside her, "she will not." He said it the way you say a fact about the weather or the lay of the land, without drama, without question. And Della, who had spent the last year fielding looks of worried concern and delicate skepticism from virtually every person in her life, felt something loosen in her chest. They filed a counterclaim through Marsh, documenting the fraudulent lien with every piece of evidence they could gather, and Grant sent word to contacts in Wichita, men he had done honest business with over the years, asking for anyone who had documentation of Doyle's prior fraudulent practices. 2 men responded within a week with letters detailing their own experiences. A third, a rancher named Burrows from the eastern counties, agreed to come to Caldwell and make a sworn statement. It was, in short, a fight. A careful, legal, protracted fight conducted through documents and testimony and courthouse arguments rather than rifles, but a fight nonetheless, and it had stakes that were entirely real. If Doyle succeeded in his manufactured claim, Della would lose the land. She and Caleb would have nowhere to go. She did not allow herself to dwell on this possibility. She worked the problem the way she had always worked problems, systematically, relentlessly, without self-pity. But there were evenings when Caleb was asleep and the wind was at the windows and the weight of it pressed down, when she sat at her kitchen table and pressed her hands flat on the wood and breathed through the fear that lived just below the surface of her competence. It was on one of those evenings that Grant came by unexpectedly. He knocked at her door after dark, a thing he had not done before, always arriving in daylight with some practical purpose, and when she opened the door, she could see immediately that something was wrong. He held a piece of paper in his hand, and his face had that extreme stillness she had come to associate with things that cost him greatly. "Sent a man to threaten Ray Cobb," Grant said without preamble. "Told him if he continued to assist your property there would be consequences for his family." Della stared at him. "Is Ray all right? For now. He is not going to back down. He is a stubborn young man, God bless him, but this tells me Doyle is escalating." Grant came inside because the wind was picking up and the temperature dropping, and Della closed the door behind him. "He is trying to isolate you, cut off your support, make you feel alone enough to give in. That is his pattern," you said. "Yes." She looked at him directly. "Are you telling me this because you think it will frighten me into backing down?" "No," Grant said with a force of simplicity that was absolute. "I am telling you because you need to know what we are dealing with and because you deserve to make decisions with full information. I have never once thought you should back down." We did not escape her, she thought. "This man is loyal in a way I have not experienced often in my life, and I am in grave danger of falling in love with him, and the timing is absolutely terrible," she said. "Then we continue." "Then we continue," he agreed. He stayed for 2 hours that evening. They drank coffee and planned, examined the documents, discussed the next steps with Marsh, talked through what Doyle's escalation might look like and how to prepare for it. But there were also stretches of conversation that had nothing to do with Doyle, or the land stretches where they talked about Tennessee, which Grant described with a quiet love that surprised her coming from a man who had left it so thoroughly behind, and about St. Louis in summer, which Della described with equal parts affection and relief at having escaped it. They talked about books, both of them readers, which felt like finding a piece of home in a strange country. He had a copy of Dana's 2 years before the Mass that he had read so many times the spine had separated, and she had brought a battered copy of Jane Eyre that Thomas had given her when they were courting, and they spent 20 minutes arguing about whether Rochester was a villain or simply a fool, and it was the most at ease Della had felt with another person since before Thomas died. When Grant left that night, he paused on her porch and looked at her in the lamplight that spilled from her doorway, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. There was something in the air between them present, warm, and acknowledged by both without being named. "Good night, Della," he said, and the use of her first name, which had happened gradually over the months, still had the power to catch in her somewhere. "Good night, Grant," she said. She watched him ride north toward his ranch in the cold dark and stood on her porch a moment longer than was strictly necessary before going inside. Spring came to the Kansas plains with the sudden generosity of a region that makes you pay for spring all through winter, and then delivers it extravagantly. The grass went green almost overnight, the Chicaskia ran full and clear, and the sky over Della's property became that specific shade of blue that painters had always gotten slightly wrong, because it was too saturating to be credible on canvas. The legal battle with Carver Doyle was building toward its critical moment. Elliot Marsh had assembled a formidable file of counter-evidence, the sworn statement from Burroughs, the letters from Wichita, documentation showing that the alleged debt James Sullivan supposedly owed had been fabricated from whole cloth using forged dates and fictitious witnesses. A hearing had been scheduled at the county courthouse in Caldwell for the second week of April. The week before the hearing, Doyle made his most direct move. He came to Della's door himself, on a Thursday morning when Grant was at his ranch and Caleb was inside doing his lessons. He came alone this time, which was more frightening than when he'd brought men, because it meant he had decided to be personal about it. He stood on her porch with his hat in his hands in a performance of civility that was deeply menacing, and he told her that the hearing was going to go badly for her. He told her that he had friends in the court system, which was probably true, because men like him always had those friends, and that the evidence she had assembled would be discredited. He told her that she was going to lose her land one way or another, and it would be better for her and her boy if she accepted a fair price now, and moved on rather than going through a legal ordeal that would cost her what little money she had. And then he said, "The rancher you have been keeping company with Hunter, he has given you bad advice. He has a personal stake in fighting me that has nothing to do with your welfare. He is using you, Mrs. Sullivan. His hidden motive is revenge for something that happened years ago. Do not let a man's private grudge sacrifice your security and your son's future." It was clever. She recognized that immediately, even as something cold moved through her. He was trying to create a fracture between her and Grant, plant the seed of doubt, make her question whether the man she had been trusting carried a dark past and hidden motives that put her at risk. She looked at Carver Doyle for a long moment without speaking. Then she said, "Mr. Doyle, Grant Hunter has told me everything about his brother and about you, everything. He does not have hidden motives, he has honest ones. The difference between the two of you is that his are out in the open for anyone to see. You should go now." Something moved in Doyle's face, a flash of something uglier than he usually let show. He replaced his hat on his head with deliberate care and said, "You will regret this stubbornness, Mrs. Sullivan." "Possibly," she said, "but I will not regret my judgment of character. Good day, sir." She shut the door. She stood with her back against it for a full minute, shaking not with fear but with the concentrated energy of having held herself very steady through something that had required it. Then she straightened up, checked on Caleb, who had heard the voices and was watching her with large, careful eyes, told him everything was fine, and went to saddle her horse to ride to Grant's ranch and tell him what had happened. She arrived to find him in his paddock working with Ridgeback, the Appaloosa stallion Ray Cobb had described to Caleb months ago. The horse was magnificent, cream and brown spotted, 17 hands at least, with an intelligence in his dark eyes that was immediately evident. Grant was working with him without a saddle, using only his voice and subtle pressure, the kind of training that required absolute patience and presence. He looked up when he heard her horse and read her face before she said a word and came immediately to meet her at the fence. She told him what Doyle had said, All of it, including the part about Grant's hidden motives and the suggestion that he was using her. Grant was silent for a moment. Then he said, "I want you to know he is not entirely wrong that I have a personal stake in this. That is true, but I want to be completely clear with you about something." He held her gaze without wavering. "My personal stake in bringing Carver Doyle to account has never once in these months made me anything less than fully honest with you. Every piece of advice I have given you has been given purely for your benefit. If the situation had ever arisen where my personal agenda conflicted with your welfare, I would have told you and stepped back. You deserve to know that." She looked at him in the bright April morning with Ridgeback watching them both from the paddock with his intelligent horse eyes, and she thought, "I know that. I have known that. I trusted it before he said it." "I know," she said. "I came to tell you, not to question you." Something in Grant's face opened slightly, like the brief loosening of a tension he had been carrying without knowing it. "Thank you," he said, and those two words were freighted with more than their surface weight. "He is afraid of the hearing," Della said. "That is why he came in person. He would not have come himself if he were confident." "You are right," Grant said. "He is rattled, which means we have him." The hearing, when it came, was a tense and extraordinary day. The Caldwell courthouse was a solidly built limestone building that smelled of wood smoke and old paper, and it was full that April morning. Not because the case itself was widely publicized, but because Carver Doyle was a known figure in the region, and people were interested in seeing whether he could be made to answer for anything. Ranchers and townspeople filled the benches. Elliot Marsh sat at Della's side, his evidence files stacked with meticulous precision. Grant sat directly behind her, and she was aware of his presence there with the whole of her back, a steady, anchoring warmth. Doyle had a lawyer from Wichita, expensive and smooth, who worked hard to cast doubt on every piece of evidence Marsh presented. He questioned the authenticity of the letters from Wichita. He attempted to impugn the character of Burroughs, the rancher who had traveled to give his sworn statement. He presented his fraudulent lien with an elaborate supporting affidavit that had clearly taken significant effort to fabricate. But Marsh was prepared for all of it. He had anticipated every angle Doyle's lawyer would try, because he had been watching Doyle's methods for years, and because Grant had briefed him thoroughly on exactly how Doyle operated. The counter-evidence was airtight. The forged dates on the lien document could be demonstrably shown to postdate James Sullivan's actual death by 3 months. The alleged witness to the original debt had been located. He was a man named Ferris, who had since moved to Colorado and who had written a letter, which Marsh now produced, stating clearly that he had signed nothing for Carver Doyle and that the signature on the lien document was not his. The presiding judge, a compact, deliberate man named Judge Holloway, who wore his authority without theatrics, took his time with the evidence. He asked precise questions. He was not impressed by Doyle's lawyer's smoothness or by Doyle's own performance of injured dignity. He ruled in Della's favor. He dismissed the fraudulent lien with a written finding that characterized it as a deliberate falsification. He did not, in that hearing, have the authority to pursue criminal charges against Doyle. That would require a separate proceeding. But he noted, with the deliberateness of a man who chose his words with care, that the evidence of fabrication he had reviewed was sufficiently compelling to merit referral to the territorial prosecutor's office. When the ruling was delivered, Della felt something release inside her that she had been holding tight for months. Not just the tension of the immediate fight, but something older and deeper, the particular strangling grief of feeling utterly without resource, without ground to stand on, that had begun with Thomas's death and had wrapped itself around everything since. She was sitting in that courtroom on her own land in a legal sense, and she had won it, and she was not alone. She turned around and found Grant's eyes. He said nothing. He did not need to. The look on his face said everything she needed. They were outside the courthouse in the April sunshine, Marsh shaking hands around him, when Carver Doyle passed close to Della in the small crowd. He stopped. He looked at her with those cold eyes that had never once, through all of this, seemed genuinely human, and he said very quietly, "This is not finished, Mrs. Sullivan." She said just as quietly, "I believe it is, Mr. Doyle." He moved on. She watched him go, and Grant appeared at her shoulder, and they stood there together watching Doyle's expensive black coat disappear into the crowd, and Grant said, in that same quiet way, "He will not come at you again directly. He knows now that you are not someone he can wear down. Men like him only fight battles they believe they can win." "Are you certain?" "No," Grant said honestly, "but I believe it. And Marsh will make sure the referral to the territorial prosecutor moves forward. Doyle has been careful for 20 years. He will be more careful now, with eyes on him." She nodded. The day felt wide open around her, a feeling she associated with relief, but which was also something else, something she was ready to acknowledge to herself even if she was not yet ready to act on it. She was in love with Grant Hunter. She had been for some time, probably, and had simply been too occupied with survival to give the fact its full weight. But standing in the April sunshine outside the Caldwell courthouse with the threat of losing everything now officially lifted, she felt the reality of it with a clarity that was almost dizzying. She was in love with him, and she had no idea what to do about it. And she had a son who was still working through his own complex feelings about Grant's presence in their lives, and she was going to need to be careful and patient and honest in equal measure. She was good at all three of those things. She hoped it would be enough. May brought warmth and the long golden evenings of the Great Plains that made the horizon feel impossibly far and beautiful. Grant's visits, which had always had the texture of practical neighborliness, shifted gradually into something that both of them recognized as courting without either of them having explicitly said so. He came in the evenings more than the mornings now. He brought things, small, thoughtful things, a book from the Caldwell Lending Library, a packet of seeds she had mentioned wanting, once a small carved wooden horse that he set on her kitchen table without comment, and which Caleb picked up and examined with a careful reverence that told Della everything about where her son's heart was quietly moving. Caleb's relationship with Grant was its own separate and delicate unfolding. The boy had been opening up degree by degree, since that first interaction at the well pump, asking questions about ranching, about horses, occasionally following Grant around when he came to help with something on the property, watching with focused attention the way a child watches someone they want to learn from. But there was always a tension in it too, a guardedness that Della recognized as love mixed with loyalty to his father, and she did not rush him through it. She would not rush him through it. It was in late May that the moment in the barn happened, the moment that had opened this story, the moment everything before had been building toward. Grant had been showing Caleb how to properly check a horse's hooves for stones, a practical skill delivered in the matter-of-fact way he delivered everything. And Caleb had been listening with that particular quality of attention he reserved for things Grant taught him. And then Grant had said something that Della had not heard clearly from where she stood in the barn doorway. Something about how a man's first responsibility was to the animals in his care, that the animals depended on him completely and deserved that dependability, and something in it must have struck a nerve in Caleb, because the boy had gone very still, and then suddenly, with the explosive illogic of a child's grief, he had said the thing that had no rational cause but all the emotional cause in the world. "You are not my father. You cannot tell me anything. My father is dead and you are nothing." The silence after Grant's response, "I cannot replace your father. I would never insult you or his memory by trying. But I can show you what loyalty looks like, Caleb, if you will let me," was the most complete silence Della had ever experienced in a room. Caleb ran. Grant rose. Their eyes met, and in that meeting there was a whole conversation that neither of them had room for just then, because Della immediately went after her son. She found Caleb behind the barn, sitting with his back against the sun-warmed wood, his knees pulled up, his face turned away. She did not say anything immediately. She sat down beside him in the dirt and the dry grass and waited. After a long while, Caleb said, in a voice that was very small and very old at the same time, "Do you like him, Mr. Hunter?" She considered the question with the full seriousness it deserved. "Yes," she said, "I like him very much." Caleb was quiet. Then, "Do you love him?" She had promised herself she would always be honest with her son because he had experienced the worst kind of surprise the world could deliver, and because the only real protection she could give him now was truth. "I think I might," she said. "That does not mean anything changes about your father. Your father was real and he was good and we will always love him. But loving someone new does not take away what was already there. A heart is not a small room that gets full. It is more like," she paused, searching. "It is more like this sky. It can hold a great many things at once." Caleb sat with this for a while. A meadowlark somewhere was singing its particular bright, rising song. "Papa would have liked him," Caleb said finally, in a voice so quiet she had to lean toward him to catch it. "Papa liked honest men." She put her arm around her son and held him, and felt the way his thin shoulders gradually unknotted under her arm, and thought about Thomas, about his broad grin and his easy laugh, and the way he'd thrown Caleb over his shoulder like a sack of grain and made the boy shriek with delighted terror. And she let herself miss him cleanly, without the ragged guilt that usually accompanied the missing. "Yes," she said, "Papa would have liked him." She went back to find Grant a while later. He was still in the barn, completing the task he had been showing Caleb, checking the horse's other 3 hooves with the same methodical care, as if he needed to finish what he started regardless of what else had happened. Della leaned against the barn door and watched him work. When he finished and straightened, she said, "What you said to him was the right thing. Exactly the right thing." Grant looked at her. "I meant it, every word." "I know you did. That is why it was right." He set down the hoof pick and crossed the space between them with the slow deliberateness of a man who has made a decision and intends to honor it. He stopped close enough that she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the weathering of the sun, the particular quality of his attention that she had first noticed in the general store and had been noticing with increasing depth ever since. "Della," he said, "I want to tell you something that I have been carrying for several months and that deserves to be said plainly rather than implied." She waited. "I love you," he said. "I have been in love with you since sometime in December, if I am being specific about it, and I have been very patient, and I think you know it already, but I believe in saying things directly." There was something enormously moving about the way he said it, not the declaration itself, though that was moving enough, but the precision of it, the December, the "I think you know it already," the "I believe in saying things directly." Everything about him was in those words. She said, "Since December." "Yes. It was the evening you told me about Thomas and did not cry, and then changed the subject to something practical, because you have this habit of letting yourself feel something, and then immediately doing something useful. I found it," he paused. "I found it one of the most admirable things I had ever witnessed." She did cry then, not much, not loudly, but 2 tears that tracked down her face before she could stop them, which she was slightly furious about. "I love you too," she said. "I have been considerably more patient about it than the situation required, but yes." He took her hand. Not with the sweeping drama of a dime novel. He simply picked up her hand in both of his large, work-calloused ones and held it, and stood there looking at her with those gray eyes that had never once, in all their months, been anything less than completely honest. "I would like to court you properly," he said. "And then when you feel it is right, not before and not because of any pressure from me, I would like to ask you to marry me." "That is a very organized approach to romance," she said. "I am an organized person." "I know," she said. "I like it about you." He almost smiled again, that rare, genuine thing. "Then we are agreed." They were, in fact, agreed. The summer of 1882 in Caldwell, Kansas, was hot and occasionally violent, with storms that rolled across the plains like artillery. And through it all, something quiet and true was growing between Della Sullivan and Grant Hunter, in the way that things grow on the frontier, slowly, stubbornly, against resistance, and ultimately with remarkable strength. Grant courted her with the same focused reliability he brought to every other aspect of his life. He came on Sundays in his good coat and sat with her on the porch in the evenings, and sometimes brought things to read aloud, which turned out to be one of their shared pleasures. His voice had a low, even quality that made long passages of prose sound like music. They rode together on Saturday afternoons when the weather allowed, and she discovered that he was genuinely funny in a dry, understated way that required paying attention to catch, and she paid attention. He also, with a separate and careful patience, continued to build his relationship with Caleb. This was the thing that undid her in the end if she was honest about it. She could have kept her emotional guard around her own heart for quite a bit longer. She was stubborn enough for that, but watching Grant with her son removed every last defense she had. He did not try to be Caleb's father. He was absolutely clear about that, consistent about it, in a way that was itself a form of respect for the boy. But he was present and steady and genuinely interested in Caleb as a person, which was different from what the boy received from most adults, who tended to treat him as a child to be managed around rather than a small human with his own interior life. Grant asked Caleb real questions and waited for real answers. He taught the boy things, not in a pedagogical, instructional way, but in the organic way of adults who simply include children in what they are doing. How to mend harness leather, how to read the sky for weather, how to approach a nervous horse with slow movements and a calm voice. One afternoon in July, Della came around the corner of her barn to find Grant and Caleb sitting side by side on the fence rail, both of them looking out at the plain, saying nothing in particular, and there was something about the quality of their shared silence, so at ease, so companionable, that stopped her where she stood. Caleb looked up and saw her, and he smiled. A real smile, the kind she remembered from before Thomas died, the kind that had been absent so long she had started to be afraid it was gone for good. And she thought, this man has given me back my son's smile, and I will never stop being grateful for that for as long as I live. Grant asked her to marry him in September. It was the first cool evening after the summer heat broke, the kind of evening the plains sometimes gave in early September, where the temperature dropped just enough that you could feel autumn coming, and the sky went an extraordinary deep blue before dark, and everything smelled of cut grass and cooling earth. They were sitting on her porch. Caleb was inside, asleep. The lantern light fell warm and amber through the window. Grant said, I believe I told you in the spring that I would ask when you felt it was right. I think it is right. But I want to ask you, not assume. So, Della Sullivan, will you marry me? She had known it was coming. Had been thinking about it all summer, in fact, in the background of everything else, turning it over like a smooth stone in her hand. She had thought about what it would mean for Caleb and what it would mean for herself and what Thomas would have thought, and what she wanted now, at 29, on the Kansas frontier with the rest of her life ahead of her. Yes, she said, I will. He exhaled a single, quiet breath of relief that told her he had not been as certain as he'd appeared. She found this endearing in a way that she decided never to mention to him, because it would embarrass him. He took her hand again in both of his, and this time he kissed it, a single, formal, warm press of his lips to her knuckles that was more moving for its restraint than any grand gesture could have been. There is something I need to tell Caleb, he said, before we make any announcements. With your permission, what do you need to tell him? What I should have said more completely in the barn in May. Something I think he needs to hear directly from me before this becomes official. She thought about this. Then she said, yes, I think that is right. He spoke to Caleb the following afternoon. Della was not present for the whole of it. She gave them privacy, occupying herself with tasks near enough that she could hear the tone without the words. What she heard was Grant's low, even voice going on for some time, and then a shorter period of Caleb's voice, and then a stretch of quiet. When Grant came to find her afterward, Caleb was with him, and the boy's face had been crying recently, she could see that, but there was also something in it that was different from his usual grief, something that looked more like relief than sorrow. She found out later from Caleb himself the gist of what Grant had said. He had told the boy that he loved his mother and wanted to marry her, and that he wanted Caleb to know about it before anyone else because Caleb's feelings mattered completely in this. He had told Caleb that he would never try to replace his father or pretend to be something he was not. He had told him that Thomas Sullivan, by everything Della had ever said about him, was clearly a man worth honoring, and that the best way Grant knew to honor him was to care for the family Thomas had loved, and to be the kind of man Thomas would have respected. And he had told Caleb, this was the part Della came back to again and again in the years that followed, that loyalty was not about being family by blood. It was about showing up consistently for the people you chose. It was about being there when it was hard as well as when it was easy. It was about making promises and keeping them through all the seasons of a life, the good ones and the bitter ones. I cannot replace your father, Grant had said. I have no interest in trying. Your father was your father and he always will be, but I can be someone you count on. I can show you every day what it looks like to stay. Caleb, age 8, had listened to all of this with the serious attention that was his greatest quality, and then he had said in that old and young voice of his, "My mama is the best person in the world." Grant had agreed with complete sincerity. "Okay," Caleb had said. "You can marry her." Della, hearing this later, laughed until she cried and then cried until she laughed, and Grant stood by looking quietly pleased with himself in a way that she had decided was one of her favorite things about him. They were married in October of 1882, on a Saturday morning with the cottonwoods turning gold along the Chicaskia and the sky doing its extravagant best. Elliot Marsh stood with Grant. Caleb stood beside his mother, holding her flowers with fierce concentration. The ceremony was conducted by a Methodist minister named Reverend Aldridge, who had been performing frontier weddings for 20 years and had a gift for making them feel both serious and warm. The congregation was small Ray Cobb, Burroughs the rancher from the eastern counties, a handful of Caldwell neighbors, and several of the women from the local community who had been cautiously but genuinely kind to Della since her arrival. When the minister got to the promises, Della and Grant looked at each other over the small space between them, and she thought, this is what it looks like when loyalty is chosen rather than inherited, when it is made in full knowledge of difficulty rather than in innocent faith, and it is, therefore, more solid than most things that exist in this world. She said her vows with a steady voice and heard his with a steady heart. Caleb, beside her, held the flowers so carefully that not a single petal fell. The winter of 1882 into 1883 was their first as a family, and it was a good winter in the way that things built on honest foundations are good, not perfect, not without difficulties, but fundamentally sound. They combined the households over the autumn months, Della and Caleb moving to the Hunter Ranch, which was larger and better established than her 60 acres, though they kept her property and planted it the following spring with cattle forage. The ranch was a working place, all business in the good way, solid outbuildings, a proper kitchen in the house, a bedroom that was given to Caleb and that the boy decorated slowly and deliberately over the winter months, adding things in the careful, considered way of a child learning to inhabit a new space. Caleb began calling Grant by his first name, which was different from what Della had expected. She had wondered if the boy might eventually try out some variation of father or papa. But Caleb used Grant, always and only Grant, and it quickly became clear that this was exactly right, because it was honest. It acknowledged what Grant was, something specific and real, and not a replacement for anything. And Grant received it with the same matter-of-fact warmth he gave everything. Ray Cobb became a fixture of Caleb's life in a way that went beyond mere ranch hand. He was 22, cheerful, with a younger brother back in Missouri whom he clearly missed, and he adopted Caleb with a brotherly affection that Caleb reciprocated enthusiastically. They did chores together, argued about horses, and once constructed an extremely elaborate trap for a raccoon that had been raiding the grain store, which took 3 days and ultimately caught nothing but a completely unbothered opossum. News came from Wichita in January that the territorial prosecutor had opened a formal investigation into Carver Doyle's land practices, based in large part on the evidence that had emerged from Della's case. 3 other families came forward with similar stories. By spring, Doyle was facing charges that promised to keep him occupied for quite some time in territorial courts, and the general consensus among people who knew his history was that he would not be doing much land grabbing for the foreseeable future. Grant received this news with the particular quiet of a man who has waited a long time for something to move and feels the movement finally happening. He did not celebrate loudly. He sat on the porch that evening and looked at the dark Kansas sky, and Della sat beside him and understood without words that he was thinking about Preston, about the brother who had not lived to see this, about the debt of love and guilt that Grant had been carrying for 8 years and would probably always carry to some degree, though perhaps with less weight now. She put her hand over his on the porch rail and left it there. He turned his palm up and held her hand, and they sat together in the cold January dark, and it was enough. Spring came again, and with it, news that made Della laugh with surprise and joy and a private terror that she recognized as entirely appropriate. She was expecting a child. She told Grant on a Tuesday morning in March, before breakfast, in the kitchen, with no particular ceremony because she had never been good at building up to things. She simply said, "I am going to have a baby," and watched his face do something extraordinary, a series of rapid progressions from comprehension to disbelief, to a happiness so unguarded and immediate that it was the most naked she had ever seen him, and it was the most beautiful. He crossed the kitchen and took her face in his hands and kissed her and said against her forehead, "Are you well? Are you all right?" "I am completely well," she said. "I am wonderful." She was, in fact, wonderful in the particular way of people who have survived enough difficulty to know the difference between ordinary happiness and extraordinary fortune. They told Caleb together that evening. The boy sat with it for a moment very seriously, and then he said, "Will it be a boy or a girl?" "We do not know yet," Della said. "It is too early." "I would like a brother," Caleb said, with the frank preference of a 9-year-old, "so I can teach him things." Grant said very seriously, "I will take that request under consideration." Caleb looked at him. "You cannot control that." "No," Grant agreed, "but I appreciate your directness on the subject." Caleb had developed over the winter the particular pleasure of Grant's dry humor. He had learned to watch for it, to catch it when it came, and to respond with a reciprocal dryness that was entirely his own. It was one of the things that made watching them together such a specific joy for Della. The autumn of 1883 brought a son. They named him James Thomas Hunter, James for Della's brother, Thomas for her first husband, and Hunter because he was Grant's too, in every way that mattered. He was born in November, healthy and red-faced and astonishing, as all newborns are, in his complete and absolute existence. Caleb held his brother with an expression of terrified responsibility that made Della's chest ache with love. Grant stood by the bed and watched the two of them together and was, for a full 10 seconds, unable to speak, a circumstance so rare that Della noticed it and catalogued it as one of the great images of her life. "He is very small," Caleb said. "He will grow," Grant said, recovering himself. "Will he be interested in horses?" "Probably," Grant said. "Most people, given adequate exposure to horses, find them interesting." Caleb considered baby James with renewed attention, apparently now viewing him as a future recruit for some project or another. "When can I teach him things?" "Give him a year or 2, Della said. James Thomas Hunter grew from squalling infant to sturdy, bright-eyed toddler over the course of the following seasons, demonstrating early on that he had his father's steady watchfulness and his mother's fierce stubbornness, which was a combination that the family agreed, with some alarm, would be formidable. Caleb took his role as older brother with enormous seriousness. He was, at 10 and then 11, at an age where he was outgrowing certain things and growing into others, and James gave him something important to grow toward. He was patient with the little boy in a way he was not always patient with other things reading to him, showing him objects with patient explanations. And occasionally, when he thought no one was watching, making ridiculous faces that produced in James a deep and genuine belly laugh that could be heard from one end of the house to the other. Grant watched all of this with an attentiveness that Della recognized as love, the quiet, non-demonstrative love of a man who shows it not in declarations, but in the quality of his presence. He was present in the way he had promised, consistently, through the seasons of their life, through a drought in the summer of 1884 that required difficult decisions about the herd, through a harsh winter in early 1885 that tested the ranch's resources, through the changes in the cattle trade as the railroad expanded, and the long drives became less necessary and the economics of ranching shifted, through Caleb's adolescent difficulties and his eventual mastery of them, through James's childhood illnesses and recoveries, through all of it, in the daily, unglamorous, necessary way of a man who has decided what his life is about and does not deviate from it. In the spring of 1885, Della discovered she was expecting again. This time she told Grant at the kitchen table after dinner, with Caleb doing his schoolwork at the other end of the table and James already asleep. She simply said, "It is happening again," and Grant looked up from the ranch account ledger he had been reviewing and smiled a full, real, warm smile that she had been accumulating evidence of for 3 years and still found newly remarkable each time. "Good," he said simply. "Good," she agreed. The second child came in the fall of 1885 and was a girl. They named her Margaret Louisa Hunter Louisa for Grant's mother, Margaret for no particular reason except that it was a name Della had always loved. She arrived at the beginning of October with less drama than James had and immediately demonstrated a personality of formidable intent, which manifested early as an absolute refusal to sleep when anyone wanted her to, a passionate opinion about everything, and eyes that were, unmistakably, Grant's exact shade of gray-blue. Caleb, at 12, treated his sister with the combination of bemused affection and faint alarm that older brothers have always accorded baby sisters. James, nearly 2, was initially suspicious and then deeply fascinated. Grant held Margaret on the first evening of her life with the ease of a man who has now done this before, but also with that particular attentiveness. She had come to think of it as the Hunter attention, the quality of being completely present that he brought to every person in his care. She watched him and thought about something he had said to her very early in their acquaintance, in those first winter months when the frost was on the windows and they were building something out of practically nothing, that loyalty means being where you are needed, not where you want to be. He was needed here. He knew it. He had chosen it deliberately in full knowledge of what it cost and what it gave, and he had not deviated from it by so much as a fraction. In the winter of 1885, Caleb turned 12 and reached a threshold that Della had been aware of approaching for some time. He was old enough to understand things that required, she felt, direct conversation. He came to her one cold evening when Grant was at the barn with Ray Cobb working on something to do with the machinery, and James was asleep, and little Margaret was in her cradle making the small contemplative sound she made when she was working out the world, and he sat across from his mother at the kitchen table and said, in the tone of a person who has been working up to something, "I want to know what you think Papa would have thought of all of this." Della looked at her son, this boy who had grown up so steadily and so hard, who had come through so much and carried it, as Thomas had always carried things, with a particular kind of dignity. "I think he would have thought that Grant is a good man, and I think he would have been grateful." Caleb nodded slowly. "I think so too. I have thought about it a lot." He paused. "I still miss him, Papa, every day." "So do I," Della said, "every day. But I also—" Caleb stopped, and the stopping cost him something. She could see it. "I love this family, what it is now, And I wanted you to know that I think you did the right thing, bringing us here and Grant. I think you did the right thing." She reached across the table and put her hand over her 12-year-old son's hand, so much bigger than it used to be, so much more like Thomas's hand than it once was, and she said, "Thank you. That means everything to me, Caleb, everything." He straightened up in that way he had of collecting himself after vulnerability and said, "Do you think Grant knows how I feel?" She thought about this honestly. "I think he suspects. But I think it would mean a great deal to him if you told him yourself." Caleb considered this. Then he nodded, with the resolution of someone who has decided to do a difficult thing and intends to follow through. He went to the barn. Della did not follow. She sat at the kitchen table with Margaret's quiet sounds filling the room and the lantern burning warm and steady, and she waited. Grant came inside about an hour later. Alone, Caleb had apparently gone to bed, and he stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment with an expression she could not immediately read. Then he crossed to where she was sitting and sat beside her, not across from her, and he said in that stripped-back, essential way he had, "Your son just told me that he is grateful I am his family." Della said, "What did you say?" "I told him that I am grateful he gave me the chance to be, that I know it was not simple for him." He paused. "And I told him his father would have been proud of him. I hope that was the right thing to say." Della thought of Thomas, his broad grin, his easy laugh, his absolute and uncomplicated love for his boy. "Yes," she said, "it was exactly the right thing to say." Grant was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I spent a long time before all of this, believing that the most important thing was what I had failed at. Preston. The debt I could not repay. I carried it like it was the truest thing about me." She waited. "But the truest thing about a person is not their worst failure," he said. "It is what they do afterward, what they choose to be. I chose this." He looked at her in the kitchen lamplight in their home, with their children asleep down the hall. "I will keep choosing it." She leaned forward and kissed him, not with the restraint that had characterized their earlier months, but with the full warmth of 3 years of a real life built together. And he kissed her back with all the quiet intensity that lived in him beneath the calm surface. And Margaret made a small sound from her cradle, and they broke apart and laughed softly together, and the night closed warm around them. The years continued, as years will on the frontier, with their particular mixture of hardship and abundance, difficulty and joy. The Kansas plains did not become easier with time. They simply became more familiar, more known, which is a different thing but equally valuable. By 1887, Caleb was 14 and working the ranch alongside Grant with genuine skill. He had a gift with horses that was unmistakably his own, different from Grant's patient, ground-level relationship with the animals, more intuitive, quicker, the kind of feel that cannot be taught but only discovered. Grant recognized it and refused to interfere with it. Let the boy find his own way with the horses, and then supported what emerged rather than shaping it to his own methods. It was, Della thought, one of the most beautifully generous things she had ever witnessed one person do for another. James, at 4, was a compact, sturdy, wildly curious child who got into everything and asked questions about all of it with a relentlessness that Grant met with patient explanation every time, no matter how many repetitions were required. He was, quite obviously, his mother's son in temperament, that same forward motion, that same instinct to understand a thing by engaging with it rather than observing it. Margaret was too, and Margaret was a force of nature. The investigation into Carver Doyle concluded in 1887 with a conviction, not for Preston Hunter's death, which could not be proven beyond reasonable doubt after 8 years, but for a series of fraud charges related to fraudulent land transactions, including the fabricated lien against Della's property. He was sentenced to 10 years in the territorial prison at Lansing. Grant heard the news from Elliott Marsh on a Thursday afternoon and came home and told Della, and then walked out to the paddock by himself for about half an hour. She let him have that. When he came back inside, his eyes were clear. "It is not everything," he said. "It is not what I wanted for Preston." "No," Della said. "But it is something. It is not nothing." He looked at her. "He will not hurt anyone else for 10 years, and maybe not after that either if the evidence that comes out at the sentencing does what Marsh thinks it will." "It is justice," Della said. "Incomplete because justice often is, but it is real." Grant nodded. "I want to go to the grave," he said. "Preston's grave. I have not been since. I have not been in years. I want to go and tell him." "Of course," Della said. "I will come with you if you want." He looked at her with those winter sky eyes that were a little brighter than usual in a way she recognized as the residue of tears that he had shed in private in the paddock. "Yes," he said. "I would like that." They went the following weekend, the two of them, leaving the children with Ray Cobb and his new wife. Sarah Ray had married the previous year, a quiet, capable woman from Caldwell who had immediately become one of Della's closest friends. Preston Hunter was buried in a small cemetery 4 miles east of Caldwell, on a rise that looked out over the plains in all directions. Grant stood at the grave for a long time without speaking. Della stood beside him and put her hand through his arm and felt the tension in him gradually ease, the way it eased after physical labor, as something that had been held long and hard was finally set down. He said eventually to the grave, "She is everything I told you she was not in my letters home that I never sent. She is better than I knew how to imagine." He paused. "And we have children, 2 of them mine and one who was hers before me and who chose to include me, which is the greater gift of the 2, I think." He paused again. "I did not forget you. I never will, but I am not carrying the weight the same way anymore. I think you would not have wanted me to." He was quiet after that, and the wind moved through the dry grass on the hillside, and the sky was very large and very blue above them. Della pressed closer to his arm and said nothing because there was nothing that needed to be said. On the ride home, Grant said, "I want to tell you something." "Tell me." "When you first came to Kansas, when you appeared in that general store in Caldwell with your son and your 2 suitcases, and the look on your face of a woman who has made a decision and intends to live with it, I noticed you immediately. Not because I was looking for anyone. I was very deliberately not looking for anyone. But you had a quality," he paused, working the words, which he was always careful with. "A quality of being completely present in your own life, like nothing about you was provisional or apologetic." "I found it admirable," she said with a thread of humor echoing his word from earlier months. "Yes, and terrifying." He glanced at her sideways with something that was absolutely a smile. "You terrified me thoroughly," she laughed. "Good. I think you were insufficiently terrified of most things." "Only most things," he agreed. They rode the rest of the way home through the late afternoon gold of the Kansas plain, and the horses moved at an easy amble, and the distance between them on horseback was small enough that their knees occasionally brushed, and it was enough. It was everything. The story of Della Sullivan and Grant Hunter does not end, of course, because the stories of real lives do not end so much as they continue beyond the point where the telling stops. But there is a moment, a particular evening in the autumn of 1888, that serves well as a place to pause and take the measure of what had been built. Caleb was 15, and he had decided, with the calm certainty of a young man who knows his own nature, that he wanted to ranch. Not in spite of the difficulty of the life, but because of the way the difficulty required all of you all the time, and he had come to understand that he was a person who functioned best when fully engaged. He had told Grant this in a conversation that Grant relayed to Della afterward with a kind of quiet reverence, the reverence of a man who understands that he has been trusted with something precious. James was 5. And was at the stage of life where he intended to help with everything and was genuinely useful with about 1/5 of it, and undauntedly convinced that his ratio was much higher. He followed Grant and Caleb around the ranch with a proprietary confidence that made everyone around him laugh constantly. Margaret was 3, and Margaret had opinions about every single thing in the known universe and communicated them without the slightest hesitation. She had recently developed a passionate attachment to Ridgeback, the Appaloosa stallion who was now 11 years old and showing his age slightly, but was still magnificent and entirely aware of it. Margaret's method of engaging with Ridgeback was to stand outside his paddock and address him at length, which he bore with equanimity. Grant had told her she could sit on his back the following spring, when she was 4 and a bit bigger, and she was counting the days with an intensity that he found deeply gratifying. And there was, as of that autumn, a 4th child expected, a discovery that Della had made in August, and that Grant had received with the same unguarded happiness he always had, that moment of pure, helpless joy that was the most undefended she ever saw him. On this particular October evening in 1888, they were all on the porch, Della and Grant, Caleb, James, and Margaret, in the long blue dusk after supper, watching the first stars appear over the Kansas plain. The air smelled of dry grass and cold coming, and something smoky from the chimney, and it was, in the uncomplicated way of ordinary evenings that are not ordinary at all, perfect. James was asleep in Grant's lap, his solid small body completely limp with the total abandon of sleeping children. Margaret was sitting beside Caleb on the porch steps, telling him something with great emphasis and many hand gestures that he was listening to with earnest attention, his long 15-year-old legs stretched out in front of him. Della sat beside Grant, her shoulder against his, watching her children. She thought about the afternoon in the barn, the cracking voice, the terrible word nothing, and then the quiet voice that had answered it with something true and lasting and unshakable. She thought about the train from St. Louis, about the prairie going on forever outside the rattling window, about the terror and the grief and the $63, and the stubborn belief that forward was the only direction worth moving in. She thought about Thomas. She thought about him every day, in the small ordinary ways that grief becomes with time, a presence rather than an absence, something carried warmly rather than with anguish. She thought he would have loved this porch, this evening, this particular sky. Grant said quietly, so as not to disturb James, "What are you thinking?" She considered being precise and decided, for once, not to be. "Everything," she said. He turned his head and looked at her, and in the blue evening light his eyes were the color of the sky just above the horizon, and his face had the deep ease of a man who is exactly where he has chosen to be. "Good," he said. He put his free arm around her, careful of his sleeping son, and she leaned into him, and Caleb's voice rose slightly as he responded to something Margaret was insisting upon, and the stars came out one by one over the Kansas plain, and the night was cool and clean, and full of the sound of the family they had built from the materials of grief and courage and loyalty and love. The 4th child was born the following spring, a boy, brown-haired and blue-eyed like his father, whom they named Preston Ray Hunter, the first name for Grant's brother and the second for Ray Cobb, who sat outside the door during the birth with his hat in his hands and his wife Sarah holding his hand, both of them pretending not to be emotional about it and failing entirely. When Grant told Ray that the child bore his name, Ray Cobb went very quiet and then said, "That is more than I deserve," in a voice that made it clear he understood it was not a small thing. "You kept faith with this family when Doyle threatened you," Grant said. "You stayed. That is exactly what this family is built on." Ray nodded, looking at the floor, and then looked up and said, "I am honored, truly." Caleb, at 16, held his new brother with the assurance of a young man who has done this before and who understands now what it means, not just the physical holding, but the commitment that comes with it, the long, unglamorous, daily choosing of showing up. He handed Preston carefully back to Della and looked at Grant across the room, and something passed between them that needed no words and received none. James, at 6, was most concerned with whether Preston would be interested in horses at the earliest possible opportunity, and when informed that this might take several years, accepted the information with the stoicism of someone who had learned patience from people who practiced it consistently. Margaret, at 4 and now in possession of the Ridgeback riding experience she had been promised, was briefly resentful of the attention the new baby received, and then redirected her considerable energies toward informing Preston, in his bassinet, about everything there was to know about Appaloosa stallions. Preston, being 3 weeks old, found this neither interesting nor uninteresting, but Margaret found it extremely satisfying. On a Sunday in May, when the spring grass was very green and the Chicaskia ran full, and the sky over the Hunter Ranch was that impossible blue that painters always got slightly wrong, Della Sullivan Della Hunter, though she had kept her first name always as it was, as the name she had brought west with her on the train from St. Louis, stood on the porch of her home and looked at everything she had built. Not alone. She had never rebuilt alone, though she had started alone, which was different and important. She had started alone and then found, in the very specific shape of one Grant Hunter of Caldwell, Kansas, the particular human being whose idea of loyalty matched her own at the bone level. He came out of the house behind her and stood beside her on the porch, and she turned to look at him, and she thought, this is what it looks like when you choose forward over backward, when you choose the living over the pure, uncontested grief for the dead, when you let loyalty be not a burden but a way of moving through the world. She thought of everything he had given her, not the practical things, though those mattered, but the real things, the steadiness, the honesty that had never once in all their years been weaponized or withheld, the way he had held the space for Caleb's grief without trying to fill it with himself, the way he had kept his promises in every season, ordinary and extraordinary alike. She thought of that moment in the barn, when an 8-year-old boy had called him nothing and he had answered with loyalty, and she thought, everything began there. Everything that they were was seated in that moment. What are you looking at? He asked in that tone that meant he knew exactly what she was looking at and wanted to hear it anyway. Everything, she said again, because it was still true. He laughed, a full, real laugh, the kind that had become more frequent over the years, the kind she had worked to earn and now received like sunlight. He put his arm around her, and she leaned into him on the porch of their home on the Kansas plain, with the Chicaskia running somewhere in the distance and the sound of her children inside, and the wide, extravagant, merciless, beautiful sky above them going on forever in every direction. She was not afraid of forever anymore. She had come to the edge of it on a train from St. Louis 7 years ago, looked straight into its enormous face, and decided to walk toward it. She was glad with everything she had that she had not looked away. Inside the house, Margaret's voice rose in passionate declaration about something, almost certainly horses, and James's voice rose in response, and somewhere in the noise of it, very small and very new, Preston made a sound that was the sound of someone just beginning to understand that he was here, that this was his family, that these people were his. Grant heard it too. She could feel him turn his head slightly toward the window. He said, "Should we go in?" She looked at the plain one more moment, at the grass and the sky and the river shimmer in the middle distance, and the shape of the land that had brought her here and kept her and been her ground when the ground was gone from under her, and she said, "Yes." They went in together. The door closed behind them, and the Kansas afternoon went on, wide and golden and full of the ordinary, extraordinary life of people who had chosen each other in full knowledge of the cost and the gift of it, and who went on choosing, every day, for all the days that followed.